Hello and welcome to this episode of the Optimizing Human Performance podcast with me, Martin Jones, and my co-host, John Paul Nevin. Today's episode is all about food and nutrition and how we can use these things to get the most out of our bodies.
We can only store a maximum amount of about 4,000 kilocalories of energy as carbohydrate. And that's why commonly you see people run a marathon. They typically describe hitting the wall about mile 20 or so, and that's probably because they're running out of muscle glycogen.
Leading physiologist and nutritionist, Professor Javier Gonzalez reveals the dietary strategies that can make a real difference to your performance.
The type of carbohydrate matters in terms of performance, and if you want optimal carbohydrate availability, then hitting glucose-fructose mixtures at relatively high rates will help a lot.
We explore the science behind some of the most popular diets and look at the importance of finding the right balance.
People have probably heard of the concept of carb loading before an event, where you start to eat more carbohydrate, but often people overdo that. When you store glycogen, you also store water, and you could end up quite heavy on the start line.
Whether you're an athlete, a coach, or just simply fascinated by human potential, there's a lot to learn from today's discussion. Hi, Javi. Welcome to the Optimizing Human Performance podcast. Can you talk us through who you are, where you are, what you do, and how you've got to where you are today?
Yeah, I'm Javi Gonzalez. I am Professor of Nutrition and Metabolism at the University of Bath, and I'm based in the Centre for Nutrition, Exercise and Metabolism. So we're interested in how the foods we eat can be stored as energy, how we can use that energy during exercise, and what happens if we run out of that energy. In terms of my background, I was very much interested in sport through playing rugby union as a teenager. I then studied an undergraduate degree in sport and exercise science, continued through master's and PhD. At PhD level, I started to then specialize in the nutrition space. Up until then, I'd actually focused a bit more on respiratory physiology. So I'm kind of a physiologist first and foremost, but I study nutrition from a physiological perspective. After my PhD, I started to study endurance exercise. So we were using a technique known as magnetic resonance spectroscopy, where you use an MRI scanner to non-invasively measure what's going on in the liver and in the muscle of these athletes. And we got a couple of studies out of that period on carbohydrate ingestion during and after exercise. After that, I came down here to Bath, where I've been ever since in the academic world. And I also had a brief stint at a pro cycling team that are now INEOS Grenadiers, formerly Team Sky.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Javier, you mentioned doing a lot of work around endurance. So if you were working with an individual and they were training for an endurance event, what sort of strategies or guidance would you provide?
Yeah, I think one of the key things to think about, at least from a nutrition perspective, is the fuels that we use during exercise, how we can use a couple of different fuels in particular, and how they vary in what happens when we're burning them. So basically, it's worth thinking about when we go from a period of rest to just light intensity exercise, we're increasing the energy that we require, that our muscles are using. And that energy demand can be met by carbohydrate and by fat predominantly. So we use very little protein during exercise. We'd only use alcohol as a fuel if, of course, we've ingested it. The vast majority of time we're using fat and carbohydrate as our main fuels. So the fats will be coming from the breakdown of our fat stores under the skin. Some of the fat is actually already stored in the muscle and can be broken down and used. And then the carbohydrates will be coming from the circulating sugars, the glucose in our blood, and that will be coming from the breakdown of stored carbohydrate in the liver. And then we've also got a store of carbohydrate in the muscle itself, and that's called muscle glycogen. And what happens if we increase the intensity of exercise? So, for instance, going from walking to a light jog through to a run, we get an increasing demand specifically on the carbohydrate-based fuel. So we start getting through that glycogen much more quickly. The problem comes because we can't store very much carbohydrate in our bodies. So if you take a typical athlete, they could be a very lean athlete with a low body fat percentage, they'd still have a load of fat there as energy. Okay, so even a lean athlete could easily have over 60,000 kilocalories of energy as fat. And that's enough in theory to run for days on end. But the problem is we can't use fat very quickly as a fuel. It's kind of a slow burn fuel. And that's why when we increase the intensity of exercise, we become reliant on carbohydrate. but we can only store a maximum amount of about 4,000 kilocalories of energy as carbohydrate, and probably even less than that in the muscle that's actually active. And that's why commonly you see people run a marathon, like the London Marathon, for example. They typically describe hitting the wall at about mile 20 or so, and that's probably because they're running out of muscle glycogen at that point. So I'd say that kind of concept of we use a couple of different fuels during exercise is worth bearing in mind for nutrition, because it sets the basis for how we would then intervene.
Let's get straight into this, Javi. I'm interested in this low carb diet that seems to be quite popular. So from what you're saying there, that would suggest to me that someone who adopts a low carb or a zero carb diet, there's a few social media influencers who would suggest almost eating organ meats only, that kind of thing. Does that mean that those people are not able to do higher intensity exercise? Have I got that right? Or they find it harder? I mean, what's the situation with those sorts of diets?
Yeah, so sometimes people approach those diets with the rationale that if you go on a low carb, high fat diet, you can increase the capacity to burn fat as a fuel. So you'll increase the ability to burn fat, and so maybe you're not using those carbohydrate stores so quickly. And that's true, right? That happens. But when you get even the highest level athletes with the best capacity to burn fat as a fuel, and you adapt them to one of these high fat, low carb diets, the maximum rate at which they can burn fat is still capped at about 1.5 grams a minute, which if you translate that into power output for a bike, then it's still only a moderate intensity. It's definitely below 250 watts, right? So you can sustain low to moderate intensity exercise purely on fat alone, but to do multiple high intensity bursts, that's where you need carbohydrate. So the scenario you describe, they might be able to do 1 or 2 sprints. They might be able to do an hour of exercise with the glycogen that's already there, but they can't sustain it over a prolonged period of time. There probably are scenarios that could be reliant on fat almost entirely, but we're talking now very low intensity exercise that is very long in durations, kind of ultra endurance running or cycling. But the caveat to that is in those races, there's often uphill elements, which automatically raises the intensity. So when I'm saying low intensity, I mean low intensity. That's where fat can in theory provide the fuel. But there could still be an advantage of taking on board some carbohydrate in those scenarios.
Spinning it completely around, what about if someone adopted a very high carbohydrate diet and they had a very small consumption of fats and proteins?
Yeah, the main things to consider there, I think, are not necessarily the performance in the acute sense. It probably wouldn't harm their performance on that day, but it's more about longer term health and adaptation. So protein and fats play an important role in general health. There are some essential fats we need for things like our cell membranes. Proteins are important for a whole variety of physiological actions in the body, and in particular, the turnover of our muscle protein. So if we're looking to adapt to exercise, for example, then we need sufficient protein to support that whole process, but also protein stimulates that process. When we ingest dietary protein, it's both a stimulus to support the growth and the adaptation of muscle, but it also provides the building blocks to support that too.
In an event where the duration of the event is largely unpredictable, you think it's going to be a relatively low level, let's say a moderate or a low intensity walk, but you just don't know how long it's going to be. What should we be telling people? Is it go for one of the extremes, somewhere in the middle? Like if you were fueling for unpredictability, have you got any thoughts on what could be done to improve performance?
Yeah, so intensity is one factor that dictates the fuels we use. So the higher the intensity, the more carbohydrate and the less fat. But the other thing is duration. So if you go at the same intensity and you just carry on at that intensity, then you'll start to use more fat and less carbohydrate. And that's basically once your carbohydrate stores are starting to become depleted. And that can affect performance because carbohydrate has a number of advantages as a fuel. So to burn carbohydrate as a fuel and to liberate the energy, you need less oxygen. So it's more oxygen efficient to burn carbohydrate as a fuel. It's also, as we've already mentioned, a more rapid fuel, and it might also play a role as a signaling molecule in our muscle. So with all that in mind, if you're unsure of the scenario, you're probably better off having sufficient carbohydrate available to be prepared for any scenario, because the carbohydrate can fuel both high and low intensity exercise. The fat can only fuel the low intensity exercise. You don't have to overdo it though, but yeah, I'd focus on the carbohydrate.
You mentioned the London Marathon. So if we had someone competing in that event, obviously they're going to be operating relatively high intensity. What sort of strategies would you advise to an individual in terms of their carbohydrate intake? May that be through the use of gels, bars, liquid? How would we get the balance?
Yeah, great question. And actually, I ran London Marathon at the weekend, so know how it feels to do it. It's hard. First of all, it's worth thinking about what you're doing in the couple of days before. So people have probably heard of the concept of carb loading before an event, where you start to eat more carbohydrate, but often people overdo that. So I think the main thing to be aware of is you want to ensure you've got sufficient carbohydrate in the diet, but it's not about overeating. So the carbohydrate is displacing fat and protein for those couple of days before. Also, you don't have to overdo the carbohydrate, because when you store glycogen, you also store water, and you could end up quite heavy on the start line. So you don't want to underdo it, but a moderate amount of carbohydrate, sufficient amount in those couple of days before. That's one thing. Then on the morning of the event, overnight, the liver will become slightly depleted in its carbohydrate store, because it's constantly providing glucose for our brain that never lowers its energy requirement. Our muscle glycogen remains relatively similar overnight, because it's lying there resting and mainly using fat as a fuel. So in the morning, you want some kind of carbohydrate in the breakfast just to top up that liver glycogen again. Okay. Generally, you want it to be low in fiber and low in fat and low in protein, or moderate in protein, just so that it's relatively easy to digest and absorb and store that carbohydrate.
So we're talking a bowl of Cocoa Pops.
Exactly. Rice Krispies, Cocoa Pops. Exactly. Then you start the race. What's the strategy there? Well, you want to provide some extra carbohydrate to top up what you've already got and support the energy demands of the race. Now, the format of carbohydrate, in terms of whether it's liquid or gels or even solid jellies, as long as they're low in fat, protein and fiber, then it doesn't seem to make much of a difference whether it's liquid or gel. We absorb it relatively similarly, at least based on current evidence. What does make a difference is the type of carbohydrate that's in there. So if we're ingesting glucose, if we increase the ingestion rate, so if we go from, say, 30 grams per hour to 60 grams per hour to 90 grams per hour, the amount that's actually available to burn as a fuel seems to be capped at around 60 grams per hour. So you're maybe putting more into your stomach, but you're not absorbing it across the intestine, and so it's not available for use. And then there was a body of work mainly done by Professor Javier, who showed that if you combine glucose with fructose, a different type of carbohydrate, then you can absorb more of the carbohydrate more quickly across the intestine. And the concept is that the glucose is absorbed across the intestine through a specific transport protein, a bit like a door getting from the intestine into the bloodstream. And the fructose uses a different type of transport protein. So you can get more carbohydrate in more quickly. And the studies support that. And when they then tested whether that actually affects performance, it seems to also affect performance similarly. So the type of carbohydrate matters in terms of performance. And if you want optimal carbohydrate availability, then hitting glucose-fructose mixtures at relatively high rates, so up to about 90 grams per hour, will help a lot.
So that idea of these two different gates, or these two different transporter mechanisms, you say glucose is capped at around 60 grams. Is there a cap for fructose? Is there a limit? Because I've read some of the professional cyclists at the moment are consuming hundreds of grams. I think Tadej Pogacar's, is it 150? I think I've read once, or even 200, I think, in some reports. So is it 60 grams glucose and the rest fructose, or do they start bringing in galactose or any other types of carbohydrates?
Yeah, great question. And really, we don't know. No one has done the dose response for fructose, but what we do know is that 60 grams per hour is an average. And some of the work we've been doing over the last few years is trying to understand whether some individuals can ingest and oxidize more of that glucose alone. And based on our recent work, the larger the athlete, the more of that carbohydrate they can digest and absorb. There may also be other factors such as training status and habitual diet as well.
On that then, Javi, is there scope for recommendations similar to protein in regards to how many grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body mass?
Crudely, yes. And actually, it's funny that the older guidelines for sports nutrition were based on a gram per kilo per hour recommendation. Then the more recent ones by the American College of Sports Medicine switched to grams per hour. But I think there's potentially a justification to do it based on body mass again. The only caveat to that being that the fact that a larger athlete can digest and absorb and use more carbohydrate is mainly because they've got a larger intestine, which probably correlates more with someone's height than it does their body mass. But I'm not sure I'd base a recommendation based on height. It would just seem a bit odd. So I think there's scope to do that. Yeah.
Are there any other individual variations that might determine how you are going to fuel for endurance? Obviously, we've talked about body mass, potentially height. What else do people need to be aware of when they're trying to come up with a personalised approach to their nutrition?
Yeah, so there are probably some modifiable factors and then some unmodifiable factors. So at least based on some rodent studies, the habitual diet can influence the number of these transporters on the intestine. So if the rodents have a diet that's high in sugars and carbohydrates, the intestine seems to adapt and increase the number of these transport proteins across it. Habitual fiber intake could be another one, because we know that fiber stimulates the release of certain hormones from the gut, and those hormones are involved in stimulating gut growth and some of the turnover of these proteins in the gut. So it's a bit theoretical. We haven't got solid evidence in humans, but there are suggestions of some things we could do there. And then there are the unmodifiable factors where some people might naturally have a larger intestinal surface area and more of these transport proteins.
In terms of the delivery mechanism of the carbohydrate, we talked about gels, jelly blocks, solids. Are there issues if someone sticks to a particular delivery mechanism? And I'm thinking about experiences where someone has consumed too many gels, shall we say, and it didn't work out too well for them. It essentially ran through, being polite.
Yeah.
So what would be the optimum balance there?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely worth trialing and training and making sure your own personal approach, both to the rate of ingestion and also the types of products you're ingesting, that you feel comfortable with them. So on your important race or event, don't trial out something new on that day and don't start suddenly consuming more because you're feeling worse. You definitely need to stick to what you know and what you can tolerate. And the other thing to bear in mind are things like the environmental temperature can affect all of these things. So if you're exercising in the heat, then this rate of ingested carbohydrate oxidation can be lower by as much as 10 to 30% lower. So there's a lot of other factors that also play a role in the responses we see.
Javi, can we talk about your time working in professional cycling? What was your role?
Yeah, so I joined in early 2020. I joined as the lead nutritionist. The role evolved a little bit into the head of human performance, so including a bit more physiology as well. Went on my first race and COVID was starting to spread across the world, and that was then the last race for probably 3 or 4 months. So I then had to integrate within the team largely remotely. I was basically responsible for the other nutritionists in the team who would be interacting with both staff and riders. We'd have a team of professional chefs as well. So the riders would have this kitchen truck that would travel around to the training camps or races, and we'd have full control then over everything they ate. There's a role in the team called a carer or a soigneur, and they basically do a lot of the sports massage on the riders, but they also do a lot of food prep. So the food that the riders would have on the bike, the rice cakes and the sandwiches and so on, the carers would do that. And the other reason it was important to talk to them was during massage was a good way to sneak in a bit of education to the riders, because the carers would be chatting away, the riders might have questions, and if the carers know what they're talking about, then you can drip feed information to the riders that way. So it was a great experience to learn about the sport and also learn additional skills of how to manage people and interact with people and gain trust.
So Javier, from a nutritional standpoint, especially like some of those ultra long distance events, what was the sort of calorific expenditure you were seeing in the riders, not only during the competition, but in training?
Yeah, so it varies a lot day to day. If you take various stages of the Tour de France or one of the big grand tours, one day might be a time trial or a rest day. And even on a rest day, they'd still do probably an hour on the bike. So it's not zero, but it's very low. If we include their resting metabolic rate and the exercise on the bike, then we're probably talking about 2,500 kilocalories a day. So that's a low day. The high day could be as much as 10,000 kilocalories a day in total. So it's like 7,500 on the bike with one of the larger athletes. So the variance is huge. The other thing to bear in mind is in cycling, they all have different roles. So one cyclist might have expended that amount of energy. Another rider might have done most of their work early in the day and actually gone quite easy to finish the stage. And so they might have had a low expenditure. So The way you then deliver your nutrition to those riders would be very different, and you need sufficient options available, and for them to have the knowledge to know what to choose if you're not providing it for them. So we'd often tailor the way we approach nutrition with the desires of the athlete. Some of them like to be told exactly what to do. Some of just want to be given sufficient information to make the decision themselves. And then on top of that, not only is nutrition providing fuel, but of course it's enjoyment. They want to enjoy the food they're eating. They have to eat a lot. And so you have to make it interesting and enjoyable. And the chefs do an incredible job for that.
What was the long-term physiological impact that you were seeing after one of these events? We had Professor Greg Haff on from Edith Cowan University a couple of weeks ago, and we were chatting about the impact of an arduous military selection course, and they quantified individuals were burning something between 6,000 to 7,000 calories per day over a 45-week period. And obviously that kicked their arse, for want of a better word, physiologically. Yeah. So I'm just curious to see how that impacted cyclists.
Yeah, I think that probably impacts more on the lead into the Grand Tour, because during the Grand Tour itself, they might not hit that energy demand on the specific day, but because it's interspersed with rest days and time trial days and so on average over the 3 weeks, you can pretty much hit the requirements. But what happens in training is they're trying to make a low weight to hit their body weight target pre-event. And in that scenario, you can get symptoms that might be some kind of hint of concern. So for example, a low testosterone concentration. And so we'd constantly have regular checks, especially for the key riders who are likely to enter a Grand Tour at key points on the lead-in. And we'd work with the medical team to potentially intervene if necessary.
When they're on the bike, when they're given was it the musette bag? Is that what they're called? It's got all the food in it. Can you talk us through the kind of things that you would put in there? Essentially the ration pack, isn't it, for when they're actually on the bike?
Probably a bit better than the ration pack.
Probably a bit better. Probably a bit
exactly,
better.
Yeah.
What goes in them?
The kind of standard stuff is the solid types of foods would be little sandwiches, so ham and cheese or jam sandwiches, that kind of thing. Or it might be rice cakes, and these are not the kind of crispy rice cakes that we typically get here in the UK. If you imagine a rice pudding that has been set, so it's kind of a thick jelly substance, and various flavors. They're pretty nice. So they were like base solids that we'd provide all the time. If we were in a location that had a local speciality that was relevant, we'd also include that in there just to liven it up a bit, as long as they're high in carbohydrate and relatively low in fat. It would also include other sports nutrition products that were specifically designed. So they're these bake bars or jelly-like products, the energy gels, and then on the side of the road, sometimes you'd hand out bottles with energy gels. So there is a variety of options there, and whether the athlete is taking on board the solids, the gels, or the liquids depends on a few factors. So things like the intensity of the race. Nowadays, it's getting aggressive earlier and earlier, but in a standard classical race, it generally ramps up over the course of several hours. And so the first few hours, they'd be taking on the solids when the race is relatively calm. And then as it ramps up, they'd switch to the gels and liquids. And the other time you'd use more liquids is in scenarios, of course, like the heat, where you just want to get more fluid in, but also even in the cold. So when it's very cold, especially on some of the cobble classics, where it's hard to handle the bike on the cold, slippery cobbles, the riders don't want to take their hands off the handlebars too much, or their fingers might be numb, so they can't unwrap the products. So we'd use the carbohydrate in the drink. So we might even have a very high concentration of carbohydrate in those bottles, so that it's just easier to get the carbohydrate on board without having to fiddle around unwrapping things. So using that kind of variety of selection, we can adapt to meet the demands of the event.
Interesting. How do you plan for these things? We have talked to people about periodization, and we talk about like training periodization. Is there such a thing as nutritional periodization? And do you kind of go months out and start loading up on certain micronutrients? Or we kind of talked about carb loading briefly, but in that sort of idea, is it possible? Do you need to do that for nutrition as well?
Yeah, I certainly think it's helpful at least to periodize the macronutrients, the carbohydrates and fats, largely because at certain times you want to practice that high fueling, high carbohydrate intake during training, just to make sure that you can tolerate it in a race type scenario. But you don't want to be doing that all the time, partly because you might be dampening some of the adaptations that you want to see. So with endurance exercise, we think that some of the adaptations you get are from a lack of carbohydrate availability, and perhaps even high fat availability might stimulate some of those adaptations. So you probably want to do some training sessions or some blocks of the year with relatively low carbohydrate availability, and then other blocks with high carbohydrate availability to get the other type of adaptations we want with the intestine and with the muscle to ensure we can use the carbohydrate when it's available. So that periodization is definitely something we do and a lot of athletes do, mainly with those macronutrients. So we're balancing fat adaptation with some of the carbohydrate adaptations that we want as well.
And how about in the scenario where maybe the nature of the event, let's say, means that you are on restricted food like a ration pack, or the individuals just can't get hold of high quality nutrition? Is it possible to preload on micronutrients so that they don't deplete? Is that viable? Is that a thing that you're able to do?
Yeah, so it's viable for the fat soluble vitamins, things like vitamin A, vitamin D, although some would argue it's not a vitamin, but probably not viable for the water soluble vitamins. So things like vitamin C, we need a relatively regular supply of because we just can't store it anywhere. We just urinate it out if we've taken in too much. Whereas the fat soluble vitamins, we can store with fat in fat tissue, for example. And we know that if you take someone with overweight and obesity and they lose weight, then you can see the vitamin D potentially being released from the fat tissue into the circulation. And even exercise might do that as well. So yeah, it depends on the type of vitamin.
And things like creatine, if people are using creatine as a supplement, is it the same thing? Can you load up on it and then can you then spend 3-4 weeks without taking any, but you still get the positive benefits?
Yeah, creatine's one of those where you can load and it would last a few weeks, probably not as long as some of the fat-soluble vitamins, which hang around for quite a long time. Creatine's one that's in the middle there, where you can do for a couple of weeks without taking it once you've saturated it from a previous dosing regime.
So leading in from that question, then, are there supplements that are beneficial for performance? Just mentioned creatine, it's one that's obviously well studied and well talked about. Anything else that you feel like has a decent evidence base and is probably worth the investment?
Yeah, there are things like caffeine that are clearly performance enhancing in a wide variety of durations, intensities, even cognitive function versus physical function. So caffeine's clearly one that people probably also perceive improves their performance. Creatine, as you mentioned, very well studied and probably is even relevant to the endurance type events that we've been discussing. And as much as it also increases body mass slightly because you get more fluid retention in the muscle, even with that extra body mass, it's been shown in a few studies that the increase in performance you get offsets that. And then the other one is potentially sodium bicarbonate. So I say those three are definitely well studied and well evidenced.
Javi, our colleagues over in the US at USAREM, so United States Army Institute of Environmental Medicine, they've been doing a lot of work around the amino acid tyrosine, looking at tyrosine as a supplement to enhance cognitive function whilst under stress or high allostatic loads. Is tyrosine something which you've came across, or are you aware of it being utilised in professional sport at all?
I'm not aware of it being used in cycling at all. A few of the amino acids actually have been used with the idea of supporting cognitive function going back probably 20 years or so. I haven't seen consistent, reliable evidence of large effects, certainly not in the realms of kind of the caffeine space. But yeah, certainly open to seeing more of that.
Interesting. One of the things that I hear a lot and I see a lot is people going to the gym early in the morning before they've eaten. This idea that if you train fasted, there's some benefit to that. Can we pull that apart a little bit? What are the potential benefits and is it true?
Yeah. So when you do a bout of exercise in that overnight fasted state, compared to if you'd had a carbohydrate-rich breakfast before, you will be burning more fat as a fuel. So you'll be burning probably around 30 to 50% more fat and less carbohydrate in that fasted state. And that's often then interpreted as, well, I'll then also lose weight and get a load of other benefits. And that's not necessarily the case. We've actually studied this area ourselves, both the weight loss angle, but also whether there are other adaptations in the muscle. What's really clear is that the increased fat oxidation persists throughout several weeks of training. So if you continue doing your training in that overnight fasted state, in every single session, you'll have burnt more fat. But unless you're burning more energy in total and not eating as much, so ultimately your energy balance is dependent on energy intake minus energy expenditure, you won't lose any more weight if you're in the same energy balance. So whilst you're burning more fat as a fuel, it's offset by carbohydrate, and so your energy expenditure is the same. So for weight loss or body composition changes, doesn't seem to make too much of a difference. However, there do seem to be some adaptations in the muscle that seem to be enhanced by performing exercise in this overnight fasted state. So there's been a few studies by others and also by us showing that it can stimulate a greater increase in the number of these transport proteins on the muscle cell. So earlier on, we mentioned some of the transport proteins in the intestine. There are also different types of transport proteins that sit on the cells of muscle, and they allow the glucose to enter from the bloodstream into the muscle cell, known as GLUT4. And they respond to insulin to come to the cell membrane and allow glucose to enter the muscle cell. And in theory, if you've got more GLUT4 on the muscle then has a greater capacity to use glucose from the bloodstream. So that's a positive adaptation. You normally see that with exercise training anyway, and it seems to turn up the volume on that adaptation if you do your exercise in a fasted state. So in summary, there are some muscle metabolic adaptations that seem to be enhanced by exercise in this overnight fasted state, but it seems to make very little difference to weight loss or changes in body composition.
So, Javi, can we alter our dietary intake to change adaptation or adaptive potential? So, for example, if we were to give someone a heightened carbohydrate intake in their diet, would that increase mitochondrial biogenesis? Or conversely, if we gave someone a high protein intake, could that potentially stimulate a protein synthesis? Can those subtle changes in the diet have a downstream effect in regards to physiological adaptation?
Yeah, so there is some thinking that this training with low carbohydrate availability, which could be done in this overnight fasted state, although in that scenario, the muscle glycogen isn't really changed very much. It's more around the circulating fuels in the blood. There are other types of training where if you do, say, 2 sessions in a day, the first session will deplete your muscle glycogen, and then you start your second session with already depleted muscle glycogen. In that scenario, there's a suggestion that it might stimulate more mitochondria to be produced in the muscle. Whether that's due to the low carbohydrate or the high fatty acid availability that also happens in that scenario, we're yet to determine, and we should have a paper out soon that tries to unpick that. So that's one approach. You mentioned protein, and it's another one that, at least in theory, might support mitochondrial biogenesis. And there have been now measurements done of mitochondrial protein synthesis. So if we measure muscle protein synthesis, you can measure the whole muscle, mixed muscle, or you can split it up into the myofibrillar fraction, which is the contractile part, or the mitochondrial rich fraction. So the mitochondrial proteins, which would suggest more mitochondrial biogenesis. What seems to be the case so far is that exercise is a stimulus for that. The nutritional stimulus, if it's there, it's pretty small. Although, of course, the amino acids clearly provide the building blocks that are necessary to support that whole process. So you certainly don't want to be deficient in protein. But unlike the contractile protein, which do respond to protein very effectively, the mitochondrial proteins don't seem to respond so effectively to protein intake, at least in the acute term.
There's an old practice that still happens every now and then. There's certain arduous military courses where the individuals would be physically very, very fatigued. They'd be doing a lot of exertion over a number of days. And there happened to be a little pub just down the road, and part of the post-exertion recovery was a few pints of a certain well-known Irish stout-related beer, let's call it that. But they'd go and down a few pints. And like even now, I still hear people talking about this as like, well, that's what I did when I was on that course. I'd go and drink Guinness. Is there anything in it, first and foremost? Is that actually a bit of wisdom passed down through the generations, or is it just nonsense?
I love a beer, but it's probably nonsense.
I'm glad. Yeah.
There have been studies done where they've ingested alcohol alongside protein after exercise, and unfortunately, the alcohol seems to suppress muscle protein synthesis. So would be suppressing some of the adaptations we'd be looking for after exercise. So yeah, pains me to say it, but if you want optimal adaptation, probably best to skip that bit.
That myth needs to die, I think.
Javi, when individuals do these sort of arduous courses, there's a massive allostatic load upon them, physiologically and psychologically. And obviously that can lead to potentially a chronic inflammatory response and all the negative things that go with it. So are there things that someone can consume within their diet which could minimise the impact of that inflammatory response?
Yeah, so there are antioxidants. There's also omega-3 fatty acids. The antioxidants would be things like vitamin A and vitamin E. You could supplement with those, and they're quite potent antioxidants. The thing to bear in mind is that there are studies showing that if you superdose with these, you can blunt some of the adaptations from exercise. So exercise of course, is a stress, and then we respond to that stress with adaptation. So we want sufficient stress. We don't want too much stress. So in some scenarios, it might be worth supplementing with those, but we should bear in mind the dose that we're providing so that we're not overdoing it and suppressing adaptation. And then with omega-3 fatty acids, they're also a potent anti-inflammatory. You could either supplement with omega-3, or the other thing you could do is take a monounsaturated fat, such as olive oil, and if you increase your intake of that, it decreases the intake typically of the omega-6 fatty acids that are generally more pro-inflammatory. So you can do it a few different ways to have the positive effect of omega-3s on lowering inflammation.
You mentioned olive oil, and they just made me think of something I heard on the radio last week of individuals taking swigs of olive oil in the morning in shot glasses to try and give them some sort of protective effect. Would you advise replacing your Guinness with olive oil?
It's chip fat, isn't it, where you're from, JP? It's not olive oil.
Chip fat and buckfast.
Yeah. I'd advise using the olive oil to displace other fats rather than adding it into your diet. Although the other thing that's in olive oil, at least if it's extra virgin variety, is a number of polyphenols, which could also have some anti-inflammatory action. And obviously, being half Spanish, I also love olive oil.
If an individual was going to buy some food, or they were in the cookhouse or the galley, what sort of things would you advise them to go for?
I think it would vary on their role. So if they've got a day or a task that is going to have a really high energy demand, then they want to ensure they're getting sufficient of all of the macronutrients, carb, fats and proteins, and probably choosing the foods that are higher in energy density, so more calories per gram. So that is probably your chips or other forms of potatoes and pasta and so on, with some protein. However, if they've got a task or a role that is relatively low in energy expenditure, maybe they're sitting at a desk for a prolonged period of time, then if they were to eat that type of diet, they'd probably easily gain weight, because with a high energy density diet, it's just easy to overconsume, because for a very small plate of food, you've got a lot of calories there. So then the advice would be to avoid added oils and to typically choose foods that are low in energy density. So things like salads and vegetables, load up the plate on those, and then still have a portion of protein and maybe a very small portion of carbohydrate on the side, but really load it up with vegetables and fruit just to feel full and get fewer calories in.
Javi, can we talk about continuous glucose monitoring devices? I've seen these in the gym quite a lot. I know people use them for diabetes, but I see a lot of people wearing them at the moment. They look like a little badge on the back of the arm with a little needle in it that's measuring blood glucose. What's the value of that from a training point of view, assuming you don't have diabetes or some other similar sort of illness or disease?
So there's a bit of theory here that when we do prolonged exercise, if we're not ingesting any carbohydrate, then one of the reasons we fatigue is when our blood glucose gets too low. So we reach hypoglycemia. We've used up all of the carbohydrate in the liver. It can't supply any more glucose to the circulation, and our blood glucose concentration drops. And that can be one cause of fatigue. And if you then ingest carbohydrate during exercise, you can maintain your blood glucose concentration for longer, and you can exercise for longer. So with that kind of theory, people have thought, well, now with these CGMs, the continuous glucose monitors, we can measure blood glucose in real time, or pretty much real time, and then advise fueling strategies based on that, which initially sounds like it makes sense. But the problem is the time lag between all of these events, right? So the CGM itself, it's not measuring blood glucose concentrations. What it's measuring is interstitial glucose concentrations. So the interstitial fluid bathes our cells, and it's a separate compartment from our bloodstream. And there's a time lag between what's going on in our bloodstream and what's going on in the interstitial fluid. And it's about a 10 to 15 minute delay. So the CGMs have this delay, so they're already on the back foot. The other thing is your fueling strategy is normally planned well in advance. If you know the event is going to be hard, you're going to be ingesting carbohydrates right from the start and really frequently throughout. And so if you've got low blood glucose concentrations, it's already too late. You're not going to suddenly change your fueling strategy at that point because you've already been ingesting plenty throughout. So in an event, there's not really much logical basis to use CGMs to guide a fueling strategy. All of that said, I think they do have a role in understanding an athlete's general physiology. So for example, you could use them in training in, say, a session that they're doing in the fasted state. And you could understand how well an athlete can maintain their blood glucose concentrations when not ingesting any carbohydrate. That would tell you something about their general physiology in terms of their capacity to perhaps release glucose from the liver, their capacity to burn fat as a fuel. And the other thing that happens is if you do an intense burst of exercise, your liver will release a big amount of glucose and you get a little spike in your blood glucose concentration after that effort. And at least what we've found anecdotally is that if you get an athlete to do multiple efforts like that without ingesting carbohydrates, then those bursts of glucose get smaller and smaller over the subsequent hours. And that might reflect depletion of this carbohydrate stored in the liver. So we've still got a lot to do to understand how we can use these CGMs effectively in athletes. I don't think it's going to play a major role in fueling competition nutrition strategies, but I do think they can play a role in understanding the general physiology of an athlete, especially in specific scenarios.
Are there any other technologies that are either available now or maybe on the horizon that you're aware of that are going to potentially be important for nutrition, for understanding what we need to consume and when?
Yeah, I know there's development in sweat patches, so they can get an idea of rates of sweat loss, but also sweat composition. So which electrolytes is an athlete losing, and that could guide a hydration strategy, for example, or a rehydration strategy afterwards. There's also potential advancements in things like non-invasive measurements of core body temperature and heat flux. So there are some devices now that measure temperature at the skin, and using algorithms, they can estimate what the core body temperature is, and they seem to be improving all the time. There's also a desire to develop a continuous lactate monitor and a continuous ketone monitor. And I think they could be useful for athletes, of course, the lactate under any scenario of exercise and the ketone monitoring, especially under conditions of low carbohydrate availability, or even when an athlete might be taking some of these exogenous ketone supplements.
On ketones, just very briefly, I was asked a question fairly recently, funny enough. Someone was asking me about the ketogenic diet and whether it's beneficial, probably more from a cognitive point of view is what they're asking me. But what are your thoughts of these ketogenic diets? Well, first of all, what is it and what can it do for us?
Yeah, so the ketogenic diet is a diet that's so low in carbohydrate that the liver starts producing these ketone bodies. There are 3 ketone bodies, and they can be used as a fuel by the brain. So under normal conditions, the brain uses mainly glucose and lactate as a fuel, typically carbohydrate-based fuels, but it can't really use fat as a fuel. And so we evolved ketone bodies probably under periods of starvation then when we're low in carbohydrate availability. Because the brain can't use fat, the liver has to convert the fat into these ketone bodies to provide that alternative fuel. The muscle can also use ketone bodies as a fuel as well. And these diets do have potent effects in certain conditions. So for example, people who have epilepsy and seem to not respond to treatment often can benefit from a ketogenic diet. It seems to potently lower the number of seizures they experience. Whether that's because of a direct effect of the ketone bodies or the low glucose and carbohydrate availability, it's not completely clear, and it could be a bit of both. So clearly the ketone bodies have some effects on the brain. They also have effects on other tissues in the body. They affect metabolism in the liver, potentially affect metabolism in the muscle and the heart as well. And so that's led to the development of these ketone supplements that people use as well. The ketone supplements provide a way of achieving high circulating concentrations of ketone bodies without having to restrict the carbohydrates in the diet.
Very interesting. And do they work?
I'd say work for what, right?
Yeah, good question. It's usually me putting the difficult questions out there.
If we're thinking of exercise performance, for example, there is very little evidence that taking them during exercise will improve performance in that bout of exercise, right? The studies are pretty much all over the place, and on average doesn't seem to have a large effect there. But they may have more of a role in, say, recovery, for example.
Yeah. As someone who's at the cutting edge of nutritional science, obviously your lab's highly active and you're doing some very interesting work. What do the next 5 years look like in nutrition? You know, what do you know is coming out, or what do you expect the field to be doing over the next 5 years?
Yeah, I think part of it will be guided by what's going on in the pro athlete world. So as you mentioned earlier, a lot of athletes are taking on huge amounts of carbohydrate now, well above the typical academic recommendation. So above 120 grams an hour, as you say, some 150 plus. So understanding the physiology of that, I think, is key. And I know there are studies planned to look at what is the optimal dose response of carbohydrates. The other is then, if we're looking at that dose, what is the optimal ratio of glucose, fructose, potentially other sugars like galactose and so on. There's plans to do that kind of work. And then thirdly, it's about personalizing the dose. So there's a relatively recent paper that I was a collaborator on where we measured a specific athlete's capacity to use glucose as a fuel and then gave them a personalized dose based on that. And the whole group of athletes on average then took on board less than the typical guideline. So in the initial trial, they all had 90 grams per hour. If an athlete could only burn, say, 80% of that, then their personalized dose would be lower in the second trial. So on average, when they then did their second trial, the average intake was only 65 grams per hour, and yet they could oxidize the same amount of carbohydrate. So there's the same amount of carbohydrate available despite ingesting less. So it is a more efficient use of that carbohydrate. And as a result, their gut symptoms were lower during exercise. So I think using direct measurement in athletes and personalized doses could be one way that the field could go in the future.
That's great. What we like to do on the podcast, Javi, is just hand it over to you for the final words, just to close it out on something that you want to tell us about. Before we do that, how can people follow your work or contact you or just see what you're up to? What's the best way of them contacting you?
We've got a Centre for Nutrition, Exercise and Metabolism website. So if you just type CNEM Bath, that'll probably come up. I'm also on X and LinkedIn, so you can search me there, and I often post our recent papers on both of those platforms where you can keep in touch and ask questions.
Great stuff. We'll get all of those in the show notes so people can find them easy enough. So Javi, a big thank you from me. I really enjoyed that discussion. I'm going to forego that pizza until I start running my marathon. But over to you. How would you like to wrap up today's session?
I'd say that it's worth thinking about what the goals of an athlete or person are with their particular demand of event, whether it's the intensity, the duration, but also the practicalities of it in terms of how available are opportunities to fuel and provide nutrition, and use that to guide what type of nutrition support you're going to provide. So personalizing it not only based on physiology, but also the practicalities of the event.
That's awesome. Thank you, Javi.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
That's it for this week's episode of the Optimizing Human Performance podcast. Thanks for tuning in. And if you found this valuable, take a moment to rate and review the podcast. If you know someone who'd benefit from today's conversation, then please share this with them. We're always keen to hear your thoughts. If you have feedback, guest suggestions, or topics that you'd love us to cover, then email us at info@ophp.co.uk or connect with us on LinkedIn. Until next time, keep striving, keep improving, and keep optimizing your performance.